Conservatives. I'm Genevieve Wood of the Heritage Foundation. This is a monthly event that we co-host every week with members you see up here, and it's chaired each month by Congressman Labrador, Huelskamp, and Jordan, and they invite other free market loving members of Congress to join them on the panel as well. You're going to have some of them coming in and out during today's event, but this is an open media or open to the press. Your questions are what we're here to take, and so we're going to get started with that. The only thing that I ask is that you please state your name and the organization, the news media organization that you're with, so the members know specifically who they're talking to, and when you can, please direct your question directly to the member for which the question is being asked. So let's go ahead and get started. Who would like to open us up today with questions? All right, we'll begin up here on the front row, and just please wait for the mic to come around. Thank you.
Hi, Susan Friccio, Washington Examiner. Can I get everybody's opinion about the Education Act that's coming to the House floor today, whether or not you all will support it or what you think of it?
I'll be a no.
We are still looking at it, and I'm still undecided. There's some good things that it improves on the current system, but I'm not sure that it makes enough reform, so we're still looking at the entire bill.
In all, for a perspective as a father who spends a lot of time working on 3rd and 8th grade math with my kids, and the underlying assumption is still the same. The federal government knows best, and certainly there's some reduction in mandates, but it retains the core of No Child Left Behind, changes the name. You still have mandatory assessments. You still have mandatory testing. Those are still mandated and required from the federal government level. Common Core is, under numerous other laws, is already not allowed to be permitted. So I don't think it changes much on that front. But that is a key issue for parents across America. They're tired of Washington telling them what to do. Even if Washington's going to tell them to do a little bit less, they're still telling us what to do for my elementary school that my kids go to in a junior high. So not nearly enough change. It also, one thing to note in there, it does take the next president out of the education equation. Puts this off to make certain the next president has no voice in changing education policy. The reauthorization goes to fiscal year 2020. And so the next president is out of the equation. I don't know why Republicans would do that to ourselves when we're looking hopefully for some success in about 11 months from now.
And as of yesterday afternoon, I told the whip team I was undecided. I just hadn't gotten into that with all the other legislation I go through, and I'm anal enough. I like to read stuff. I like to read bills, and but I guess it was around 2:30 or 3 this morning, as I was going through the bill, I got concerned about what Tim was saying, that this goes to 2020. I would have thought we would want to make it as short as possible, so that hopefully we'll have a president that doesn't believe in one-size-fits-all, punishing school districts that try to help special needs kids, and letting the local folks make their own decisions. But not only have we pushed the this agenda through 2020, but we also it adds a pre-K program. Well, we've got pre-K programs in most of our schools in East Texas, and so that's not necessarily good news. It means all the strings that the federal government puts on its other grades will now be strapped onto pre-K, and there's a lot of those strings that my constituents would just as soon live without. So at this point, I've gone from undecided without reading the bill yesterday to reading the bill, getting through most of it, and being a no now.
I'm a no.
All right, we'll come back up here to the front row again.
Hi, I'm Christina Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. Could you talk a little bit about what riders are going to be most important to you on the omnibus? Thanks.
Go ahead.
You know, there's a lot of writers. The first issue when you look at the omnibus is that they're spending more money. And that to me is a negative from the beginning. We have fought to keep the spending down here in the House. We were successful under the sequester and other things, keeping the sequester in place. And it's disappointing that the Republican Party decided to agree with Democrats and increase spending on domestic and even on the military issues. I think there was a better way to do it. So now that they do have a deal on the spending levels, we're looking to see if there's going to be actual conservative policy in the bill. Our number one priority is the Syrian refugees issues. We need to make sure that we have, at a minimum, the language that was passed out of the House last week. I think it should be stronger than that, but at a minimum, the language that was passed out of the House last week. And number two, we're looking at some pro-life writers. The pro-life caucus actually has come out with 3 specific writers that they would like to see in the bill. We also are interested out in the West on the Waters of the U.S. Writer. But if those writers on Syria and pro-life issues and other issues like that are not in the bill, it's just not even worth considering the bill because the bill's spending too much money.
I think Raúl did a good job of summarizing. Let me just say this, too. Remember, 165 Republicans voted against the higher number just 4.5 weeks ago. And now there's also talk of adding things that I think make it even worse. There's McConnell's campaign finance issue that's being talked about, which we think is not the direction we need to go unless you're going to free up the restrictions on everyone. There's this whole risk corridor insurance company bailout that's being talked about. In fact, the Freedom Caucus has taken a position to be opposed to both of those, the campaign finance issue and any potential bailout for the risk corridor. So there's talk of going in what I think a lot of us would say is not the right direction. And then, so in order to get us to vote for this, you got to do what Raúl's talked about, the good pro-life issues that the pro-life caucus has put forward, and something on the Syria refugee issue.
A couple priorities I have as far as writers, and Chairman Jordan just mentioned that, the issue, pro-life issues, protecting Americans, whether the unborn or the rest of our citizenry, in terms of protecting ourselves from radical jihadists who are posing as refugees. We must address that. That's a demand of my constituents, I believe constituents all across America, and we certainly don't want to bail out Obamacare and bailing out big insurance companies. Why does the U.S. rule? But one thing, bigger picture, I'd like to note as well. We had 157 Republicans oppose the 3-month CR. We had 167 oppose the Budget Act. And so massive numbers of Republicans. I understand those numbers are probably set. But if we back down as a Republican majority with a new speaker now, we're essentially shedding the next 10 months of being able to do anything. Harry Reid will just say, hey, I'll see you with a Omni in September, because you're never going to shut the government down in the election year. And even though the president would, there is no question about that. Harry Reid would do that. And we'll see our ability to do anything in appropriations. So here's where we got to take our first stand, or we have I think, an inability to take any more stands while Obama is still in the White House.
All right, we'll go to the second row here in the blue.
Hi, Loretta Brown with CNS News. Following up on the question about the omnibus, more specifically, should the omnibus prohibit funding of Planned Parenthood? And as a follow-up on that, if it permits funding of Planned Parenthood, will you vote for it?
Great question, and I would word it as most of America approaches it. Should we fund Planned Parenthood? Should we send taxpayer dollars to this type of organization? What we have proposed is a compromise that we would let the states make that decision. And a number of states have already attempted to do that. The administration is attempting to impose a mandate from HHS. And I think the state of Kansas, where I'm from, which we have chosen not to fund that entity, instead to make certain that actually goes to women's health care, community health centers, and that's worked very well in the state of Kansas. So I think we have something that will work. And but that's something that, as far as the Republican conference, we're going to be taking up many of these writer discussions tomorrow in a conference tomorrow morning.
And like Tim, I just think it's imperative that since there appears to be so much lawlessness, that we, don't do like the administration and become lawless ourselves. It just encourages lawlessness. And so we have the power to stop lawlessness within Planned Parenthood, and we ought to take that stand. And we can make sure that the war on women that some wage, not in our party, will not continue, because we want that money not to go to people that siphon off money that could go to facilities that can actually do something like a mammogram, which no Planned Parenthood facility can, but we want that to go to facilities that can actually help all aspects of women's health, and so it should be there.
All right. In the very back, John?
Thank you, Genevieve. I would like to ask the anyone on the panel about the omnibus spending bill. And specifically, Congressman Babin is circulating a Dear Colleague letter now in which it will cut out funding for the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And this has gotten considerable support. I believe 80 colleagues have signed the Dear Colleague letter. And he indicated to me that this should be the lone issue on which the conference fights. In other words, if the president's going to veto the omnibus spending bill because Congress wants to deny funds to bring Syrian refugees in the U.S., so be it, but it should not have other matters come up in the defunding issue so as to distract from the refugee issue. What do you think are the chances of his measure actually getting in the omnibus spending bill, and will it be the lone issue on which the president has to sign or veto?
I don't know if it'll be the lone issue, but it's certainly an important one, maybe the most important one when we find ourselves in the context we do, and the focus on security. As Tim mentioned, we have a conference tomorrow devoted to this, and there'll be a few folks who share our position who will probably speak out tomorrow at that conference in support of Mr. Babin's position.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, I don't know if you were here when I was here, at a minimum it should have the language that passed last week. What I'm worried about is that our leadership's going to try to weaken even the language from last week, because I think the language from last week and Babin's bill may do similar things. I think Babin's is stronger, but I would be okay with the language from last week that was passed with a bipartisan veto-proof majority. So if we can't even get that on the bill, then we're going to have a pretty big fight. But I think we're going to have a pretty robust discussion tomorrow in conference.
And I would re-echo that this is something the American public is firmly behind this issue of the Syrian refugees, is putting a timeout on this until we can actually do adequate background checks. And when you have Homeland Security and the FBI director actually having doubts in regards to our screening process, this is something that has to come to the forefront and have a conversation.
Let me add something on that, John, as well. There are some media reports in the last hour from the Democrats claiming there was some deal that they've rejected. Speaker Paul Ryan said we would be discussing these issues Thursday morning. So if Nancy Pelosi is falsely claiming a deal, I'm not sure. Well, I understand why you would make those false claims, but the discussion will continue tomorrow morning in conference.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Eaton from the Cleveland Plain Dealer. What are your thoughts on the transportation compromise that was just announced? Have you guys had a chance to read it? Is there anything in there that you're thumbs up, thumbs down on?
We have not had a chance to, I have not had a chance to look at it in detail. Man, I have concerns about where it was all headed to begin with, but I want to look at it all before I give a final answer.
I like the fact that it's for 5 years. That's what I understand. But again, some of us are kind of anal. We want to see what's actually in the bill before we vote on it.
I think the curiosity is the pay-fors, is really understanding, is it a true gimmicky type of pay-for, or is there really validation behind it? So from that standpoint, not only looking at the details, but also the actual pay-fors in a fair and equitable manner.
As a member of the Transportation Committee, I want to vote for it, but the poison pill for me is XM Bank, and it never should have been a vehicle for that legislation.
All right. We'll go Phil.
Yes, Jose Delgado from El Nuevo Dia newspaper. What the Congress should do regarding the fiscal crisis in Puerto Rico, and I want to know your position if some of the proposals of the Obama administration can be included in the omnibus bill.
I don't know what the proposals are. Probably the answer is no. The people of Puerto Rico need to decide what they're going to do about the fiscal crisis. Unfortunately, they were in a good trajectory when Luis Fortuño was the governor of Puerto Rico. They had a good trajectory of fiscal responsibility. He was a conservative governor, and that was rejected by the voters in Puerto Rico. The people of Puerto Rico, and specifically the current government, need to come to Congress with a plan of fiscal responsibility. And until they do that, I don't think that we are going to be passing any kind of legislation that does anything with regards to Puerto Rico. I think if they do come forward with a good, honest fiscal responsibility plan, I think we are open to doing something in the Judiciary Committee dealing with Chapter 9 and other issues. But bankruptcy is not a plan. Bankruptcy is a step in a plan, and I think we have not seen a plan yet that would give us the assurance that the current governor of Puerto Rico is taking the necessary steps.
I would take it a step further. I agree with the gentleman. I don't think that should be the first step. I think there has to be a reorganization attempt, and I think that comes back to Puerto Rico to reorganize and talk to their creditors. I think that's an important application there, because how can the United States bail out somebody when we're $19 trillion in debt? Come on. And there has to be a financial reckoning that comes back to the people back in Puerto Rico that start looking at who they owe to and how they're going to restructure that.
And I was very disappointed when Luis Fortuño, very good friend, I thought he was being an excellent, responsible governor, took steps to cut the government and did, and then he was turned out as governor by the voters, which indicated that they were not ready to take steps toward absolute responsibility. I was very sympathetic. Everybody up here in front of you believes in fairness across the board for everybody. We all feel strongly about that. And so when people from Puerto Rico came up and said, hey, it's unfair, we're not allowed to file bankruptcy, and most every other entity is, but we were specifically excluded, then that creates some sympathy. But then when you find out that actually, in order to get people to buy bonds, help finance Puerto Rico, it was specifically left out of the ability to file bankruptcy in order to encourage people to buy bonds and invest in Puerto Rico, so that that helped lure the investors in. And so then it creates a question of fairness. Should Puerto Rico be allowed to say, we can't ever file bankruptcy, it's in the law, get the get people to invest in it, and then turn around and say, well, we can't cut our government, we can't be responsible, so now that we've got all this investment, we need to be allowed to file bankruptcy anyway. So there's a lot that's going to have to be done to show some real responsibility on the part of Puerto Rico. Maybe it would take putting Luis Fortunio back in there, but because he could certainly get it done, but I'm not seeing it right now. Thank you.
And just to remind the good gentleman, it was a very close election, so I think there were plenty of people in Puerto Rico who wanted to be fiscally responsible, and I think I think now you will see in the polling data in Puerto Rico that they want to find some fiscal responsibility, and I think it's incumbent upon its government to show what that plan is of fiscal responsibility.
Yeah, and just to back up and broaden our approach with all the countries out there, right? Even in terms of having, fiscal responsibility and a package, that's still policy, right? In the United States, we have policy after policy after policy. Our economy's grown at 1.5% right now. Will that turn around? I don't know. But you look at all the issues out there right now, immigration, migration, what everybody wants to know is, what does true compassion look like, right? That's the new vocabulary word that trumps everything else, and maybe rightly so, right? Or the values thing. So I worked at the World Bank 25 years ago, and I worked in academia for the last 2 decades, and the left has systematically rejected the only program that will help the poor across the world, and that is free markets. The economic literature is very clear on what causes economic growth over the long run. It is not education, right? Education is a great thing. It's not just short-run policies. You have to move and choose, as a society, the free market system. China made that move, and they've increased their GDP per capita from about $1,000 a year when I started teaching economics 20 years ago to about $9,000, right? India, $1,000 to about $7,000 now. And so, in general, now the press comes to conservatives and says, what would you do to solve all of these crises around the world? What would you do on immigration when 7 billion people, of course, want to come to the richest nation on earth? It's right. I mean, it's human nature, it's common sense. What would you do on migration issues now that countries are not growing economically, they're not trading with us, and you have tyrants running them? It's kind of an unfair question to us, because our answer is we would have put free markets at work 2 decades ago, if not more, and you would not have these problems. Countries that grow do not have these crises. And so I just want to make it real clear that when we're put in the short-run ditch, sometimes it's very hard to give a serious, substantial answer because, of course, everyone wants to come here. We want to be compassionate. If you add up all the welfare gains from all the economic policies President Obama has put together, or the Democrats for the past 10 years, they're dwarfed by the welfare gains that the free market system has delivered to China and India over the past decade. Dwarfed, right? And so when it comes to true compassion and helping the poorest people in the world do well, the people on this panel know what the serious answer is. And if you really care about the poor, you'll follow free market economics, the rule of law, and constitutional government.
All right, Phil.
Phil Wegman, Daily Signal. If there's a Republican president in 2017, should Congress just dust off the current reconciliation package in the Senate and try again, or should they try to bolster that package? And also, do you feel like voting for this measure fulfills the Republican promise to try and fully repeal Obamacare?
Yes, we should. I mean, we should grab the reconciliation package that's being put together in the Senate. It's better than the one we passed in the House. So take that one. Yes, send it to the president. That's going to be a huge. Think about what's happening right now. You got insurance companies saying they want to get out of Obamacare. You got every co-op out there, almost every co-op out there failing. All the states who set up a state exchange are saying, we took a bunch of your money, but it didn't work. We're now going back in the federal exchange. You have in Oregon where the governor may, in fact, be indicted because of what took place there. All this is happening. Of course, that makes sense. The American people know that. Their deductibles are going up. Their premiums are going up. This thing is a mess. Of course, we should get rid of it and replace it with a more patient-centered, family-centered, doctor-centered approach to healthcare.
I would actually say you don't wait just for that, because I think there are some measures you can actually take to start rebuilding the marketplace, which is key in the healthcare industry. You're seeing the consolidation that Obamacare actually was in trying to include the insurance industry, all gobbling each other's up to a monopoly. And that is to see what the insurance industry can actually do on itself. And that is break up the Sherman antitrust exemption that the insurance companies actually have. Create that marketplace, put some friction between the Federal Trade Commission and HHS so that we actually maintain that. Because you're going to have to right this ship, as the gentleman at the far end there talked about free markets. The free markets in healthcare is indicative of having something new for the horizon. And so I'm not just saying wait for a reconciliation. There are measures we can do right now that actually start to change the trajectory in regards to healthcare markets.
And I'm saying don't wait to dust it off in January 2017. If the Senate doesn't start keeping at least one of their promises that were made to get the majority in the Senate, then the fear that some Republicans in the Senate have that, gee, they won't be in the majority in January of 2017, I think will come true. I think if they keep, all of a sudden have a calcium deposit in their backbone and start keeping some of their promises, I think they keep the majority. But the problem is we have a majority in both houses right now. We told the American people, if you give us a majority in the House, we'll get things done. When we got that, we told the American people, you got to give us a majority in the Senate to really get things done. And I don't think the American people are going to let the Senate keep the current majority if we don't get some things done now. And I think that means sending the reconciliation bill to this president's desk and force him to tell people, yeah, even though I lied to you about keeping your doctor and keeping your insurance, now that I've got you trapped, I'm not going to let you out of the trap. Let us see if the president's really going to be that mean to the American people that are hurting right now.
I want to come back to one more thing is, I think you also have a wonderful scenario going on right now. So where are we going? We're going to go to a single payer plan. You really like the VA plan? Really? Is that what you want? It's a miserable attempt at health care dictated by a federal government. So this is a golden opportunity to force this ball into the public sphere, because back in my district, which is rural America, most people are going naked. They don't have insurance. They're making less than $50,000, not paying their premiums because they have other needs, and they're not getting penalized. And they're going to the hospital when it becomes an urgency aspect. We have reached a crisis point. And so if we're going to go to a single payer plan, I don't think the American public has any tolerance whatsoever looking at what the veterans have going through, where it's 50% worse today than it was a year ago. So this is a golden opportunity to set the bar. And I agree with Louis. It's time for the Senate to grow a spine and start playing ball like we promised the American people. Trust is a series of promises kept. Let's start keeping our promises.
Cindy Sain with the Voice of America. Do you think that Speaker Ryan should bring up an authorization of the use of military force to the floor, especially with the Pentagon saying that they're now sending more forces into Iraq?
It's long overdue. I mean, we should have been debating this in 2013. We took a pass. We should have debated it in 2014 and had a vote on it, and we took a pass again. And I've been part of efforts to force the vote on the floor and the debate, and it's not happened. And I'm concerned about what may be in the intelligence bill that authorization bill that we just passed.
I think it's really important that we hear from our military. Because this administration has got a failed policy. When you look at ISIS right now in Syria, where we weren't taking out the fundamental financing of ISIS by allowing trucks full of oil to go back and forth, because the truck drivers were considered casualties of war. Holy criminy sakes! How long has this gone on? And then the environmental assessment, give me a break. I want to hear from our military. It's Congress's plenary power to authorize war, and this is where we need to have that full discussion right now. And I want to make sure there is a plan before we start sending men and women into that area with having no plan whatsoever, because that's how people get hurt and killed.
Actually, under the original AUMF that was passed September 18th of 2001, the biggest problem I saw with that was the incredibly broad discretion that the power that the president was given under that AUMF. So that AUMF could authorize the president to take whatever action was necessary to protect us. The problem has been that this president, for example, in Afghanistan, as he pointed out, the war was basically won in Afghanistan, and yet I think it's 3 to 4 out of 5 of American soldiers who have died in Afghanistan have been under Commander-in-Chief Obama rather than Commander-in-Chief Bush. I keep hearing from military members who can't speak up, and they literally can't. I was in the Army at Fort Benning when President Carter was the commander-in-chief, and a lot of us were upset with the damage he was doing to our military, but we were told you get an Article 15 non-judicial punishment, or you could be court-martialed if you go public in criticizing your commander-in-chief. He's in your chain of command. It violates the UCMJ. You can't do it. So it's tough for the military to speak up, but they can criticize his plans without violating the UCMJ. And we talked about having calcium in the backbone of the Senate. Some of the guys that are wearing stars on their epaulets need to grow a backbone and speak truth to power. There's nothing court-martialable about that. And like we all know, I mean, if the military commanders are not going to speak up for their troops are in trouble. So I've got mixed feelings about a new AUMF when I see the rules of engagement that are getting our military killed. A friend, former Special Forces, just went over in September to consult with the Kurds. He showed me a video he took of truck, one after another, loaded with food, weapons, equipment, going to ICE, they were going to ISIS. We know they were going there. He talked to an A-10 pilot that was flying above, and he says, well, our rules of engagement are, yeah, we know that they're all supplying ICE, but we can't fire on them unless one of them fires on us. We can't crater the road. We can't stop the supplies. We don't have a president that's serious yet about taking on the JV team, and a JV team can beat the varsity when the varsity ties its hands behind its back.
One thing to note as well, the NDA the president just signed does require, he actually has a strategy. Here we are how many years into this situation, and we still don't have a plan. So if you want an AUMF pass, which the president indicated, you got to follow the law you just signed, give us a strategy that actually has a chance of working, needs to involve the military, not just political advisors in the White House. This is not about politics. This is about protecting the American people, and they don't want to be drug in to another endless war. And they want some answers, and they want a plan. And I think Congress should approve that plan. If it's submitted to us, then it works. I'm not saying we approve it just because he submitted, but before he acts on it, it should have to be first approved by us.
Hi, I'm Susan Cornwell with Reuters. So I've got two follow-ups. One is, I'm wondering, just on this question you were just discussing, as things stand now, would you vote against an authorization for military force in Syria? And the other question, anyone who wants to answer that. And the other question...
Has the president asked for an authorization of use of force in Syria? I keep hearing him say he doesn't want to put forces in Syria. Is he asking for one?
I think he sent something to Congress, a proposal for authorization of military force in the region. I don't, whether it's Syria specifically.
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. That
Yeah.
one that would be just enough people to get them killed instead of helping. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
I just, I wonder what I'm hearing, because when you all say, absolutely, we should be discussing this, I wonder if perhaps what you're really saying
Let
is,
me answer that,
we oppose
Susan.
involvement,
Based on what he requested, which was a
And then I have another
one-page
follow-up, sorry.
authorization, I'm a no. We've got to have a plan. We've got to have a strategy. If I'm going to put my troops from Fort Riley, ask them to leave Baghdad and start heading to Syria, there's got to be a plan. And that should require a plan as part of the authorization use of military force. I'm not going to give them one page, do whatever you think, because that has failed. 7 years of failure, and here we are sitting here today worrying about numerous things that a true commander-in-chief would have already taken care of.
If we do another AUMF, we are obligated not to make the same mistakes and leave it so open-ended that 10 years from now, some president is using that to justify a war, who knows where, against who knows what. So I would have to see the limitations in scope of time, geography, enemy, and whatnot.
Yeah, I would have to see a plan. I would have to see a vision. I would have to see a mission. I would have to see an exit strategy. All the things that advisors, usually Republican advisors, would tell their presidents are the things that we are lacking in this AUMF and in the previous AUMF, and we haven't seen it in any current AUMF. But I do think this debate needs to happen. So I can't answer your question until we have the debate, but I think the debate needs to happen, and we need to have the President of the United States, through his surrogates, come to Congress and explain to us exactly what their mission is, how they're going to fully engage, what the rules of engagement are going to be. All these concerns that we have heard from military men and women about the current skirmishes in the area. So we need to be very careful. It's the most important decision we make as members of Congress, and I think it's a shame that we have not had the debate. And this is not just the president's fault. This is Republican leadership as well that has refused to bring this up, and I think we need to have something happen and have a good, honest discussion so we can go back to our constituents and explain to them exactly what the clear mission of the United States is.
I would also say that I think that the priorities of this president, I think his AUMF is climate change. And I think that's pretty pathetic, particularly what's going on this week and particularly what we've seen happen in France.
Well, and you can't have an effective strategy. Those military leaders who are no longer active duty, taking their orders from the commander-in-chief, keep telling us that this president just can't bring himself to identify the actual enemy. And the enemy is radical Islam. And I know the president, I know Hillary Clinton's words is this had nothing to do with Islam. The president says it has nothing to do with Islam, but we have an expert, a tried and true expert who got his degrees in Islamic studies from the University of Baghdad. He says this has everything to do with Islam, and his name is al-Baghdadi. He's the guy that's head of ISIS. And his credentials are far in excess of what our presidents are. I know the president grew up as a child in a predominant Muslim country, but that nowhere makes him a president like al-Baghdadi is on what is Islam and what is not. He's got to identify the enemy before he gets more and more of our American military killed when we can't even identify the enemy.
Speaking of identifying the enemy, I mean, if you listen to the president and this administration's rhetoric on this issue, they are still fixated with taking out Assad. And I'm concerned that if we authorize anything, they would use it to perpetuate that, when in fact there is no evidence. The evidence is to the contrary, that it would make us safer or make the world safer from terrorism if we took out Assad. I mean, look at Libya. Are we going to pattern it after that? And that's my concern with giving this president authorization to use military force in Syria.
It appears that he's patterning himself after President Bush in going in and taking out Saddam Hussein. Apparently, despite all the rhetoric to the contrary, President Obama now thinks President Bush was a visionary in going in and taking out Saddam Hussein, and now he's trying to do the same thing with Assad.
Okay, just quickly, the other follow-up I had was for Congressman Huelskamp. When you said on the Planned Parenthood rider, you said that we have proposed a compromise that would let the states make that decision. I just wondered, are you speaking, do you think, for a large number of conservatives? Is this the rider that conservatives are coalescing around on Planned Parenthood?
Over 100 signatures on a letter that was part of one of the requested riders that has been presented leadership and of conference and the Appropriations Committee, trying to find something that we would be permitted to put in there. I was excited to read, I'm not sure whether he said it, whether it was reported correctly, when the majority leader announced on Monday that we would have opportunities to offer amendments to the omnibus package. We'll find out maybe more tomorrow, because I have no doubts much stronger language, which we passed multiple times through the House, would be successful in a floor amendment if leadership kept their promise to open up the Omni for debate. So we'll see what happens, hopefully in conference tomorrow morning, and learn a little bit more and move in that direction.
Sorry. Erica Warner with AP. I wanted to come back to the Syria refugees issue, because it appears that the Senate is looking at much more limited language in the Omni than what you guys already passed, and it might amount to a little more than a tweak to the refugee program. So I'm wondering if you've, how would you respond, and have you gotten any kind of commitment from leadership on what they will do on the refugee issue?
No, that's what the meeting is about tomorrow, so we haven't got any commitments. First time I hear of the Senate bill. Am I surprised that the Senate is doing something weaker than the House? No, I am not. I'm sure that was going to be your follow-up question. But no, it's unacceptable. Like I said, I think everyone agrees with me on the panel. I hope I'm correct about this, that at a minimum, we need to have the language that was passed last week.
And now that we know about the TPP, it appears it may have language that would allow the president to bring in a massive number of Syrian refugees. So we have got, it's even more important now that we have limited language, limiting the president in anything we pass. He's got to be stopped from harming America even further.
One follow-up on that. I mean, we passed a bill, veto-proof, through the House, and I guess Harry Reid's still holding that bill up. And I'm certain we have a strong Republican majority that wants to pass something to protect American citizenry. And it's not Syrian refugees, it's people posing, radical jihadists posing as refugees is the problem. And we have a constitutional duty to protect the American public. And it's not a constitutional duty to take in folks that are posing as refugees. So the Senate needs to act, need to work on that. Again, I don't know what they're doing, but have Harry Reid still stand in the way of letting bills come and have a floor debate. I mean, that is atrocious. And American people, I think, pretty upset when you have a Democrat president, a Democrat minority in the House try to stop it, and a Democrat minority in the Senate that currently is stopping it, of us making progress. We also have this visa waiver program. I mean, the Republican majority has been working months on this. But at the end of the day, when the commander-in-chief fails, again, failure after failure after failure, and then goes to Paris to talk about carbon, not terrorism. People, he's probably glad people were more focused on Thanksgiving than the president in Paris, because he is not doing his duty.
Hi, Julia Hunt, Breitbart News. I wanted to follow up on a question from last session that I think is on a lot of Americans' minds. It's two parts. The first is that in the next 5 years, the United States is expected to permanently resettle nearly 700,000 Muslim migrants on green cards, which is a population larger than the size of Washington, D.C. Senator Jeff Sessions has said that it's a, quote, unavoidable fact that bringing in large unassimilated flows of Muslim migrants creates the conditions possible for radicalization, like we've seen in Europe. So one, I wanted to get a sense, do you believe that we should freeze or permanently reduce the number of Muslim migrants brought into the United States? And two, are you prepared today to publicly call on Paul Ryan to include such language in the omnibus that would have that effect?
I tell you what, Andy McCarthy, National Review Online, had a great article in the past week about this issue, and he made the great point that we shouldn't just be checking terrorist watch lists to see who should be allowed to come into the country. Of course, we know from the FBI director and his public testimony that they have nothing to check names against. They don't have good information with people who claim to be coming from Syria. And they can even come with government passports printed from a government facility that's been taken over by ISIS, and we won't know the difference. We have no idea. But Andy McCarthy points out that a more appropriate question, since we have so many who are being recruited through social media to come join ISIS, a better question than are they on the terrorist watch list is it really true that 2/3 of Muslims coming into America believe Sharia law should be the law of the land? Because we should not be bringing in people to America who start out with the basis that their law needs to supplant the U.S. Constitution. That ought to be the number one question. And if that were asked, according to some calculations, maybe 2/3 of those already that have been brought in would not be allowed in, because those are the people that are fertile for recruitment into a more violent path forward. So it's a huge mistake. And when you look at Christians in the Middle East and our lack of sympathy in the United States as a government toward Christians in the Middle East, it is incredible. We hear from Christians around the world, why aren't you helping the Christians in the Middle East? They're the ones getting their heads cut off. Jews have largely had to flee many of these areas. Christians, it's documented, are, if they're found in UN refugee camps, they're in very few numbers because they're persecuted in the refugee camps, and the camps are not near where the Christian villages are. So there's a lot of things that need to be reevaluated about our bringing in refugees. Also, Mark Krikorian had a great article pointing out that it costs around $64,000 to bring one Syrian refugee to the United States, whereas we could take care of 12,000 Syrian refugees in the Middle East. It's a bit immoral to try to make ourselves feel better by bringing one to America when we could be helping 12 right where they are, right where they need it.
All right.
I think it comes back to what Louis was talking was the rule of law and the Constitution. I think there's a problem here. When you're bringing people here, they have to conform to the United States. We have the Constitution in which you subjugate yourself to assimilation into the Constitution. And I think that's our biggest problem that we have here, is that we've not seen that and required that. You have the biggest problem in Germany. Look at the Turkish-backed people in Germany that never assimilated. And look at the 900,000 people that they've taken in here. There's no move to assimilate them or have them assimilate to our culture, because we have an American culture. And I think Louis talks about it very, very well. This president has made this horrendously worse by not allowing these people to evade persecution in their own homeland. You know, to be able to keep people in Syria, they would much rather stay there than have to come here. And that with this president, he's just making it worse.
Well, with President Obama, the question right now, it is almost unbelievable that the president is opposed to actually thoroughly vetting those that are coming from a war-torn area full of ISIS folks. They have announced they're going to pose as refugees. And so any bigger question, when he won't even listen to his own FBI director. And so the question is, can we take care of one portion of that? Can we take care of the visa waiver issue, which, by the way, we know folks are coming in this country with no legitimate visas. And that's an additional case. And then thirdly, we still have the President of the United States wanting to import known identified terrorists from Gitmo and building a prison to hold them here to cost us $600 million. So, I mean, those are the things we're challenged on. And do we need a full-scale review of our refugee and immigrant programs? Absolutely. But this is a president who wants to give amnesty. And so the issues we've talked about that are before us, that's the issue, whether or not we can get Harry Reid and the President of the United States to say, hey, yeah, we'll at least do that minor protection for the American people. That's long overdue. And hopefully we'll be able to solve that. But again, when you have a pass veto proof in the House and Harry Reid and Obama says, don't even let us debate it in the Senate, they are missing where the American people are at. They're demanding some action.
Congressman Brown.
Yep, I think we need a pause, hard-coded into the law. We passed a bill a couple weeks back, the one that hopefully goes to the omnibus, and that hopefully provides a pause. And the logic there is that Comey has said it's impossible to vet most of the folks from Syria and Iraq because there's no data, right? So the liberal talking points a couple weeks ago was we have the most systematic screening process in the world, and they start off with the UN High Command and go down through this very intense-sounding selection process, but they leave off the only thing that matters is there's no data to use that very sophisticated system on. And so Comey and his signature that these folks will not be security threats, I think, if you put all that together, is a pause. But I'm signed on to the Babin bill, which is stronger, and the ISIS threat, now I think we all know it's not Syria, Iraq, right? It's Morocco all the way to Pakistan, Afghanistan, and up to 15 to 18 countries now. And so we face a new challenge, right, that we have not thought through as a country. And so I'm from the land of James Madison. He's in my district, and Jefferson's about 20 minutes away. And these folks are famous for their statements and documents on religious toleration. Well, we're proud of that in our liberal tradition, right? Classical liberal. Adam Smith, James Madison, etc. I think most of us are in favor of these thinkers. And so the nation started off with this classical liberal foundation and the rule of law and religious toleration. And that very principle is the one that is now in question, as some of the folks have brought up. Sharia is not compatible with religious toleration. And so the tendency it's more than a tendency for the extreme Islamic jihad tradition to want to coerce their position on others is not compatible with the U.S. liberal tradition of religious toleration. And so that's why we are truly at a new moment in our immigration policy, in our migration policy. We have not thought it through and implemented what that policy should like. We certainly have not put it through the voter. The voters have not approved or disapproved of any of our immigration or migration policies as of late. I think it's 1 million legal green cards per year, mostly attached to family status, et cetera. And then secondarily, 500,000 visas, several 100,000 student visas, et cetera. That adds up to some significant numbers, and I haven't even gotten into the economic interests. In simple form, you don't have to get too complex on immigration or migration, et cetera. If someone comes in with an average education of 10th grade, They have 2 kids in school. The cost right there is $26,000 per year. Who's picking up the tab? Right? I think the voters have concern that they want to vote on some of this, and so we should be transparent and let the American people choose the immigration and migration policies going forward. And in the meantime, when we have these very complex issues to wade through, going back to the founding, I think a pause is in order.
All right, final question. We're up against the clock in the very back.
Hi, JC Derrick with World Magazine. A month into the Paul Ryan tenure, I just wanted to get your feedback on the process. Are you guys happy with the direction of things as far as the process with various issues, and particularly the education bill? Do you guys have any issues with the way that came down at a conference?
You know, you guys keep asking that question. I think it's too early to tell. I think in 6 months, maybe 3 months, maybe 4 months, we can give you a better analysis. But, you know, I'm not going to go on a blow-by-blow of every single bill that goes through. Some things are good, some things are not great. But you need to look at the overarching, you know, way that he's doing things. And it's just too early to tell. I'm still cautiously optimistic. I was cautiously optimistic when I voted for him. And I think that that hopefully we can get better processes here. But we're not really going to learn, because it's not just about Paul Ryan. It's about the members of Congress. You know, you have a lot of Republicans in Washington, D.C. who don't want to change the way Washington works. And it's up to them to decide that it's time for them to stop business as usual. And in a few months, we'll be able to tell, but I don't think we can tell right now.
You know, Speaker Boehner said he was going to clean out the barn before he left. I think he left a mess in the barn. And there are some of these perturbations that need to filter out, and you can't hold Paul Ryan accountable for everything that's in the works. I mean, legislation is a long process. My litmus test is going to be the appropriations process next year. Do we get 12 bills done in a truly open fashion where anybody can offer amendments as long as they're germane? And do we get those to the Senate, and do we hold our ground instead of falling back to an omnibus at the first sign of trouble? And that's going to be my litmus test.
And there will be a, sorry, go ahead.
I would also say, though, is that he has tried to honor his promises. So when you look at the steering committee, he has actually gone out of his way to make sure that's been implemented. So I want to say that when somebody actually honors their promises, that goes an awful long way. Like Thomas Massey said, you know, the barn was still filled with manure, and you got to clean it out. And so
No,
this
I
is
think he
problematic.
added some.
Yeah, you know, so from that standpoint, both gentlemen are exactly right. It's going to take a whole mind shift, not just the speaker. But I think he's shown that good faith in that application. Call me the naysayer at first, but at least I want to give him his due when he actually followed through.
I agree with the good faith and the barn metaphors. And I would add my own, right? On process, it's all looking good, right? But a good process should lead to good outcomes. And you in the press can help us monitor some of those, right? The deficit just shot up dramatically due to the barn cleaning, breaking the caps. The debt went up. The economic growth rate is still subpar at somewhat 1.5% over the last several years. And you can help us monitor that, right? That's the policy. And so Speaker Ryan has promised in 2016 to crack open and reform the entitlement programs, right? They're somewhere in the $100 trillion unfunded range, right? Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, Bush prescription drug plan, et cetera. Those 4 programs and interest on the debt will consume all federal revenues in 11 years. Those 4 programs and interest on the debt will consume all federal revenues in 11 years. So if we don't fix these problems in the short term, in 11 years, there's going to be zero money left for defense, transportation, education, and all of running government. And that's on CBO. So you guys can help us tremendously. The process is heading in the right direction, but every economic indicator, not every, you guys will fact check me and I'll get pants on fire for saying most of the economic indicators, some, are negative still. And if you would report on those, today the inside cover of the Wall Street Journal is the manufacturing index is below 50. That caught everyone by surprise. That's a leading economic indicator of what our growth picture is going to look like probably next year. That's a big deal, right? So, and you guys like focusing on our Republican side. You give, it appears at times to some of us, President Obama and the Democrats a pass. I don't think they've ever produced a budget that balances ever. If you'd ever asked that question to the other side, it would be helpful to provide a little bit of contrast. At least we're trying to head toward balance. We've had deficits since Gingrich and Clinton, I think, right? And so if you're never going to balance, that seems pretty unethical and unfair to the next generation. Some of you out there appear to be in the next generation. So it's in your own interest to report on this. Thank you.
So real quickly, too, just 2 points. Remember that Paul Ryan's going to have a final exam right after the next election. We will have an opportunity to decide whether he has done a good job or not. So don't keep asking the question every week. We will give him an opportunity to prove that he's doing a good job. And number two, I am a little disappointed. We have gone to conference on 2 things. It still looks like the conference reports are pre-baked. If we want to have more openness here, you need to allow the conferees to actually bring ideas, not have something that's pre-baked between the House and the Senate. It's better than before, but just slightly. So we do have a lot of room for improvement. Thank you very much.
And thank you all very much. This will be our final CWC of this year, so Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays to everyone, and we'll pick back up in January. Thank you.